So now we're ready to speak about some Ajax basics. So what is Ajax exactly? Well, the word Ajax used to stand for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. The thing though is while Ajax started with XML, and that was the data type that was being sent over the wire between browser and the server back and forth, very few apps actually use it nowadays. Instead, most of the time nowadays, plain text sometimes is just regular HTML, and then JSON, which we're going to talk about later, is used instead of XML. Now, why does Ajax exist to begin with? Well, we can answer that question by taking a look at how traditional web applications worked and what their flow was like. The traditional web application started with a web page, and usually a user is going to press a button and that is going to generate an HTTP request that is going to be sent to the server. And the server is going to respond with some response, which is going to be a whole new page. And that whole new page could be basically 199% identical to the original page. And there might be only one string really that changed between the first page and the second page. But in the traditional web app flow, the entire page with all the same elements need to be returned anyway, just to display a minor update. Now in the Ajax web app flow, you have a web page and it also makes an HTTP request, and that is usually sent by JavaScript, and that HTTP request is sent by JavaScript, and the server also replies, and its response is a small piece of data that's inserted usually into the current page. And the only thing that changes is some minor piece of data. Now, obviously, this is way faster. The response is faster. You use less bandwidth because only one small piece of data is returned. And obviously, it's a much nicer user experience as well. Now, before we go to the process of how Ajax works, let's remind ourselves what is synchronous versus asynchronous execution, since Ajax has asynchronous as its first word. So what is synchronous execution, first of all? Well, synchronous execution is execution of one programming instruction at a time. What that means is that you can't start execution of another instruction until the first instruction has finished its execution. On the other hand, in the asynchronous execution, what that means is that it's execution of more than one programming instruction at a time. Asynchronous instruction returns right away. It sends off its instruction and it's ready to execute the next one right away. And the actual execution of that asynchronous instruction is really done in a separate thread or process. So at this point, you might be wondering, if JavaScript is a synchronous language, everything in it is executed synchronously, how is Ajax even possible? Ajax is asynchronous. Well, let's take a look at a diagram. While the JavaScript engine lives in the browser, it's not the only thing that lives in a browser. There are other components, software components, that also live in the browser. For example, you have an event queue that is responsible for handling and queuing events like a mouse click or browser load or something like that. You have an HTML rendering engine that is responsible for taking HTML and knowing how to display it in the browser web page. You have WebGL, which is responsible for letting JavaScript reach out and do some really higher end graphics work. And you also have another component that, let's call it HTTP requester. And that component is responsible for making HTTP requests. And while the JavaScript engine itself is synchronous, HTTP requester is certainly not. HTTP requester is asynchronous. So armed with this knowledge, let's take a look at the Ajax process. So we have the JavaScript engine and we have this HTTP requester component. And the JavaScript engine is going to have some JavaScript line of code being executed, then another JavaScript line of code being executed, and then finally it comes to a JavaScript line that executes an Ajax request. So what happens at that point? Well, at that point, the Ajax request uses a special JavaScript object to reach out to the HTTP requester component. And notice what I'm indicating here on the slide is that the next line of JavaScript code executes right away. The response of the HTTP requester is not waited on. Instead, when we make the actual Ajax request and reach out to this HTTP requester component, along with our request, we pass in an address of a JavaScript function that is going to serve as the response handler for when the response from the other server or this HTTP requester comes back. However, meanwhile, we continue on our merry way, and the JavaScript engine keeps executing one line at a time. At a certain point, it's executed all the code it can, and its execution stack is empty. If at that point the HTTP requester is done and has received its response from our server, it may at that point use that address of that JavaScript function that we gave it to start with and reach out back to the JavaScript engine and execute the handling of the response. And that's the callback function. That's the function that's going to handle the server response. So that's the basic Ajax process. And that's really enough of the theory. And in part 2 of this lecture, we're going to jump into the code editor and see this in action.